What would you do if all you had left in the world was a single silver dollar? What if you used it to buy the one thing no one else wanted? A derelict building filled with nothing but rotting paper and the ghosts of forgotten stories. For 20-year-old Winnie Carver, arriving in the dust-choked town of Redemption, Colorado, in the autumn of 1885, that single coin was all that stood between her and the vast, unforgiving prairie. She spent it on a shuttered bookshop, a place the town had long since dismissed as a derelict monument to a world they no longer had time for. They laughed when she did it, but buried behind its collapsing shelves, sealed away from the light for a generation, was a secret that could either build a new future for the town or tear it down to its very foundations. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the quiet girl who read the truth hidden in plain sight. Winnie Carver stepped down from the wagon, her boots landing softly in the ankle-deep dust of Redemption's only street. The journey had taken 3 weeks, a jolting, soul-wearing passage from the green hills of her memory to this flat, brown expanse of earth and sky. Her uncle, the last family she had seen her onto the transport with a thin smile and a $20 bill, calling it an inheritance. He had a new wife, a new life, and no room for the quiet, bookish daughter of his late sister. The money had dwindled with every mile, spent on stale bread and shared space in the back of freight wagons, until only the single worn silver dollar remained, smooth and cool in her palm. The town of Redemption was a scar on the landscape, a collection of unpainted wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the ceaseless wind. A saloon, a general store, a smithy, and a dozen grim-faced houses stared out at the plains. Her arrival was met with incurious glances. She was just another piece of tumbleweed blown in on a hard wind, destined to be blown out again. Her father, a gentle schoolteacher who had filled her head with poetry and her hands with the weight of books, had always told her that literacy was a lantern in the dark. As her gaze swept the bleak street, she felt the darkness pressing in. Then she saw it. At the far end of the street, slumped like an old man who had given up, was a building with a faded sign. Thorne's Books. The windows were boarded over, the paint was peeling in long, sun-bleached strips, and a notice of public auction was nailed crookedly to the door. While the rest of the town bustled with the hard, practical commerce of survival, this place was a tomb. That afternoon, the town sheriff, a man with a stained mustache and a bored expression, stood on the steps of the general store to auction off the properties of the delinquent and the dead. He rattled off a list of abandoned mining claims and lots on the edge of town, his voice a monotone drone. Finally, he came to the bookshop. "Lot 7, he announced. "The old Thorne place. Building and contents. What am I bid for this fine establishment?" A ripple of dry laughter went through the small crowd. "$1 for the firewood," someone shouted, and the laughter grew. The sheriff didn't smile. "I have a bid of $1. He looked around. $1 going once, going twice. Winnie felt the coin in her hand. It was her last. It was food for 2 more days, maybe 3. It was the sensible thing. But as she looked at the shuttered building, she didn't see a wreck. She saw the last outpost of a world her father had loved, a world of thought and quiet contemplation. It felt like the only thing in this entire town that she understood. Before she could think better of it, her voice, small and thin, cut through the murmuring. "I'll bid $1." The sheriff's gaze found her. The crowd quieted, turning to stare. A young woman, alone, dressed in a worn traveling coat, her face pale with exhaustion. The man who had bid for firewood tipped his hat in mock gallantry. "It's all yours, ma'am." The sheriff shrugged. "Sold. For $1." He handed her a single rusted iron key. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand, the last anchor to a world she knew, and the first to a life she couldn't begin to imagine. Winnie stood before the bookshop, the key clutched in her fist. The wood of the door was splintered and gray, the grain raised like wrinkles on an old man's face. For a long moment, she just looked at it, the weight of her decision settling in her stomach like a cold stone. The laughter from the auction still echoed in her ears. She had traded her survival for a pile of kindling and moldering paper, the key scraped in the rusted lock, refusing to turn. She put her shoulder into it, gritting her teeth, pushing with the last of her strength until with a tortured groan of metal, the mechanism gave way. The door swung inward on a single protesting hinge, opening into a square of profound darkness that smelled of time itself, of dry, decaying paper, of settled dust, of the patient work of spiders and mice. She stepped across the threshold, and the door swung shut behind her, plunging her into near-total blackness. The air was thick and still. A single sliver of light pierced the gloom from a crack in one of the boarded-up windows, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes. As her eyes adjusted, the shape of the room emerged from the shadows. It was chaos. Bookshelves, some leaning at precarious angles, lined every wall. Books were everywhere, spilled onto the floor in great drifts, stacked in teetering columns, their spines broken, their pages warped. It was not a library. It was a graveyard. The silence was absolute, the kind of deep, padded silence that only comes from thousands of pages absorbing every sound. Winnie felt a wave of despair so sharp it almost buckled her knees. What had she done? This wasn't a shelter. It was a ruin, a testament to failure. Her father's lantern in the dark had turned out to be a single, guttering candle in a hurricane. She spent the rest of the afternoon prying a few boards from a side window, letting in a pale, dusty rectangle of the dying day. The light revealed the full extent of the neglect. Water stains bloomed like dark continents on the ceiling. In one corner, a pile of books had turned into a solid, pulpy mass of mold. There was no furniture to speak of, save for a simple wooden counter and, behind it, a door that led to a small back room. There, she found a narrow cot with a rotted mattress, a small pot-bellied stove thick with rust, and a single grime-covered chair. It was even more grim than the main room, but it was small, containable, a space she could claim. That night, she didn't even try to clean. Exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. She swept the worst of the debris from the cot's frame, laid her worn coat over the springs, and curled up, pulling her knees to her chest. The shop was cold, the autumn chill seeping through the walls. Every so often, the building would groan, a long, low sound of settling wood, as if it were sighing in its sleep. She lay there, listening, the sole living occupant in a city of the dead, her stomach aching with a hunger that was only partly for food. She had never felt so utterly alone. Was it an act of desperation, or of faith? What secret could possibly be worth more than food and shelter? Let us know in the comments what you would have done, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden truths. Because when Winnie woke the next morning, she would find she was not the only one who believed the shop was worthless. The first light of morning was thin and gray, filtering through the dirty window pane and doing little to warm the chill in the room. Winnie's first waking thought was of food. Her stomach was a hollow ache, a constant dull reminder of her foolishness. But pride, or maybe just stubbornness, straightened her spine. She would not let this place defeat her. She would not let the town see her fail. She spent the morning with a splintered broom she'd found, sweeping a clear path from the door to the back room. The dust was a thick, choking blanket, and by the time she was done, she was covered in it. Her hair and clothes the same uniform gray as the rest of the shop. She took the bucket she'd found and went to the public well in the center of town. The women there, filling their own buckets, stopped their chatter as she approached. They watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, their eyes taking in her dusty dress and the determined set of her jaw. They whispered behind their hands, and though she couldn't hear the words, she felt their meaning like a slap. The Carver girl. Spent her last coin on that wreck. Won't last the month. She ignored them, filled her bucket, and walked back, her shoulders squared, the weight of the water and their judgment pulling her down. Later that day, as she was attempting to wash the grime from the storefront windows, a horse stopped before the shop. Atop it sat a large man in a fine leather coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded a florid, confident face. He looked down at her, a smirk playing on his lips. This was Silas Croft, a name she'd already heard spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, and it was said, most of the town besides. "Polishing a coffin, are we, girl?" he boomed, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. A few men loitering outside the saloon turned to watch, grinning. Winnie said nothing, just kept rubbing the glass with her rag. Her silence seemed to amuse him even more. "You'll find there's no profit in dead men's words, little missy," he continued, gesturing at the shop with his riding crop. "This town runs on beef and sweat, not ink and paper. You'd have been better off buying a shovel." He laughed, a loud, hearty sound that grated on Winnie's nerves. He spurred his horse and rode on, the laughter of the men following him. Winnie watched him go, her knuckles white where she gripped the rag. His mockery was a physical thing, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. She felt a burning shame, but beneath it, a tiny, hard ember of defiance began to glow. She would not be driven out by his scorn. Defeated, she retreated back inside the shop. On her way back from another trip to the well, a figure stepped out from the alley beside the smithy. It was an old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and startlingly alert. She carried a basket of dried herbs. The townspeople gave her a wide berth. Winnie recognized her as Alara Vance, a recluse who lived in a small cabin in the hills. The old woman stopped and looked at Winnie, her gaze sharp and penetrating. Then her eyes flicked to the bookshop down the street. Her voice, when she spoke, was like the rustle of dry leaves. "Some books aren't meant to be read," she said, her tone flat and serious. "They're meant to be weighed." Before Winnie could form a question, Alara Vance nodded once, a curt, final gesture, and continued on her way, disappearing as quietly as she had appeared. Winnie stood frozen, the bucket handle cutting into her palm, the laughter of the town, the contempt of Silas Croft, and now this strange, cryptic warning. It all swirled in her head, a confusing tempest of doubt and nascent purpose. She returned to the cold, dusty shop, feeling more isolated than ever, the old woman's words echoing in the vast, silent space. The next few days blurred into a routine of hard, solitary labor. Winnie's journey was no longer across the plains, but into the heart of the derelict shop itself. The decision to stay, to make this place her own, was an act of rebellion against the town's verdict and her own creeping despair. It was the only thing she could control. She started with the small back room, her sanctuary. She scrubbed the floorboards until the pale grain of the wood showed through. She patched the worst of the holes in the wall with mud and scraps of cloth. She painstakingly disassembled the small stove, cleaning out years of rust and soot until it was functional again. A man from the general store, taking pity on her, gave her a small bag of flour and some salt in exchange for her promise to sweep his boardwalk for a week. With that, she made a thin paste for supper, cooked on her newly restored stove. It was the best meal she had ever tasted. The shop itself began to feel less like a tomb and more like a silent, watchful companion. She learned its language, the groan of the roof beams in the wind, the particular creak of a floorboard near the door, the way the afternoon light fell in a golden bar across a mountain of discarded novels. The atmosphere was thick with history, with the ghosts of everyone who had ever turned a page within these walls. At night, the The silence was no longer oppressive. It was deep, meditative. She found a small, stray cat, a creature as thin and wary as herself, huddled by the back door. She left out a saucer of water and a crust of her precious bread. The next morning, the cat was still there. And the morning after that, it followed her inside, its tail a question mark. She named it Dust, for its gray coat and its appearance from the forgotten corners of the building. The cat became her shadow, a warm, purring presence in the vast emptiness. But her initial surveys of the books confirmed her deepest fears. Most were beyond saving. Dampness had turned pages into brittle, yellowed wafers that crumbled at a touch. Mice had nested in the works of Shakespeare. A beautiful set of leather-bound histories was swollen and stained, the words bleeding into illegibility. The task of sorting the salvageable from the ruined seemed insurmountable, a lifetime of work. She felt a familiar pang of hopelessness. She had bought a library of ghosts. One evening, exhausted and disheartened, she was trying to clear a path through the main room. A tall, leaning stack of encyclopedias stood in her way. As she tried to shift the topmost volume, the entire structure swayed violently. She jumped back as the books tumbled to the floor with a series of heavy, muffled thuds. The tall, narrow bookshelf they had been leaning against, freed from the pressure, groaned and scraped away from the wall. It moved only a few inches, but it was enough. In the gap, illuminated by her lantern, she saw not the rough, time-darkened plaster of the rest of the wall, but something else. It was a panel of smooth, perfectly fitted wood planks, their grain lighter, their color newer. It didn't belong. It was a piece of a different puzzle, and as she stared at it, the silence of the shop seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Winnie approached the strange section of wall, her lantern held high. The light slid over the surface of the pine boards. They were smooth, planed, and fitted together with a carpenter's precision. There were no nail heads, no visible seams, no handle or latch. It was utterly featureless, a blank space where there should have been the same rough, aged wall as everywhere else. She pressed her palm against it. Solid. She knocked, her knuckles making a dull, dense sound. It wasn't hollow. Her first thought was that it must be a repair. Perhaps a section of the original wall had rotted or collapsed, and someone had patched it with newer wood. It was the logical explanation. She was tired, and her mind, sharpened by hunger, was prone to seeing mysteries where there were none. For a few days, she let it be. Survival was the more pressing concern. She had to finish sweeping the boardwalk to earn her keep. She had to find a way to patch the leaking roof before the first snows of winter arrived. She bartered some of the less damaged books, a handful of dime novels, at the general store for a small sack of beans and a block of salt pork. It was a meager trade, but it was enough. She was learning the currency of redemption, yet the wall stayed in the back of her mind, and she wasn't the only one who found it interesting. The cat, Dust, developed a peculiar fascination with the spot. He would sit for hours on a pile of discarded books, staring intently at the base of the pine panel. Sometimes he would creep closer, sniffing along the almost invisible line where the wood met the floorboards. He would paw gently at the lowest board, a soft, scratching sound in the quiet shop. Winnie watched him, a flicker of unease stirring within her. Her father, a man who paid attention to the small, quiet truths of the world, had always said that animals knew the spirit of a place. They felt the things that men, in their haste, overlooked. A few days later, while clearing the disastrously cluttered counter, she found it. A thick, leather-bound ledger, tucked away on a low shelf. It was the shop's account book, kept by the original owner, a man named Elias Thorne. She sat on the floor, dust curling into her lap, and began to page through it. The entries were mostly what she expected: sales of books, orders for new stock, notes on customers. The script was elegant, precise. But as she neared the end of the book, the entries grew sparse. The final entry, dated almost 20 years ago to the day, was different. It wasn't a sale. It was just a few words, the ink slightly shaky, as if written in haste or under duress. It read, "For safekeeping. The weight is now yours." Suddenly, the cryptic words of the old woman, Alara Vance, came rushing back to her. Some books aren't meant to be read. They're meant to be weighed. Winnie looked from the shaky script in the ledger to the smooth, inscrutable panel of the wall. The cat purred, a low rumble against her ribs, his gaze fixed on the same spot. The weight. It wasn't a metaphor for knowledge. It was literal. The pieces clicked into place with a startling clarity that made her breath catch. The wall wasn't a patch. It was a seal. And Elias Thorne had hidden something behind it. Something heavy. A new energy coursed through Winnie, a potent mix of fear and exhilarating purpose. The wall was no longer an anomaly. It was a promise. She had to know what Elias Thorne had hidden so carefully. Her tool set was meager. A rusty pry bar she'd discovered in a crate of ruined tools and the small hammer she'd used to repair her chair. It would have to be enough. The work was brutal. She started at the bottom, trying to force the tip of the pry bar into the hairline crack between the panel and the floor. The wood was seated with incredible precision, offering no purchase. Her hands, already calloused from her weeks of labor, were soon scraped raw. Splinters embedded themselves in her palms. Every screech of the metal against the wood sounded like a gunshot in the silent shop, and she worked with a constant fear that someone would hear, that Croft or one of his men would come to investigate the strange noises. The cat, Dust, remained her loyal, silent overseer. He sat on a nearby stack of books, his yellow eyes tracking her every movement, offering a quiet, steadfast companionship that grounded her. His presence was a comfort, a silent affirmation that she was not crazy, that there was indeed something worth finding. As she worked, her hands began to learn the story the rest of the shop had been telling her. She felt the deliberate skill in the way the panel was set. It wasn't nailed or glued. It was fitted into a deep groove in the surrounding timbers. This wasn't a permanent seal. It was designed to be opened, albeit with great difficulty. This was not a patch. It was a vault. The thought sent a fresh wave of determination through her. She was no longer just a scavenger in a ruin. She was an archaeologist, an excavator of secrets. Her labor became a kind of conversation with Elias Thorne, the man who had built this. She imagined him, a quiet man of books like her father, faced with a danger so great he had to wall up its evidence. She felt a kinship with him, a shared sense of duty to the written word. After 2 days of painstaking, exhausting effort, she managed to wedge the pry bar into a corner and gain a fraction of an inch of leverage. A puff of air escaped the opening, and with it, a strange scent. It was not the familiar smell of dust and decay. It was the clean, dry scent of old leather, of beeswax, and of well-preserved paper. It was the smell of importance. That scent was all the encouragement she needed. She put all of her weight onto the pry bar, her muscles straining. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, resonant groan of wood surrendering to force, the panel shifted. She worked the pry bar along the edge, slowly, carefully, breaking the seal that had held for 2 decades. Finally, with one last, desperate heave, the panel slid aside in its groove, scraping against the floor. It revealed a dark, narrow opening, a rectangle of pure blackness carved into the heart of the building. A hidden room. And there, in the center of the small, dark space, sitting on a simple wooden pedestal, as if on an altar, was a heavy, iron-strapped leather chest. Winnie stood frozen on the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air from the hidden room was cold and still, a pocket of time that had not been disturbed for 20 years. She held her breath, half expecting the ghost of Elias Thorne to materialize in the darkness. She needed more light. Backing away slowly, she fetched her only lantern from the small back room, her hands trembling so much she could barely strike the match. With the lantern lit, she stepped into the opening. The room was tiny, no larger than a deep closet, the walls lined with the same smooth pine as the door. It was meticulously clean, untouched by the dust and decay that had claimed the rest of the shop. The lantern light fell upon the chest. It was not a pirate's treasure chest filled with gold, but something far more serious. A legal document box, reinforced with straps of black iron and sealed with a heavy lock. Beside it, on the small table, lay a slim, leather-bound journal. Her instincts told her to start with the journal. She reached out a trembling hand and lifted it. It was surprisingly heavy, dense with pages. Settling on the floor just outside the opening, with dust immediately curling at her side, she opened it. The first page read, "The Private Journal of Elias Thorne, Notary and Bookseller." The script was neat and clear, the writing of a man who valued precision. She began to read, and the story of the town's secret history unspooled before her. Elias Thorne, it turned out, was not just the town's bookseller. He had been its first and only notary, the official keeper of records, the man who witnessed and filed every land grant and deed as the town was settled. In the early entries, he wrote of his hopes for redemption, his belief in a community built on fairness and hard work. But then the entries took a darker turn. He wrote of the arrival of Silas Croft, a man with money, ambition, and a chilling disregard for the law. Thorne documented in his precise, meticulous hand how Croft and his associates began to amass land, not through honest purchase, but through intimidation, threats, and a series of increasingly brazen forgeries. He described being pressured, then threatened, to use his notary seal to legitimize Croft's fraudulent claims. Fearing for his life, Thorne had finally complied, but he had done so with a plan. For every forged deed he notarized for Croft, he carefully preserved the original, the true territorial grants and homestead contracts belonging to the town's founding families, many of whom had been driven out, believing their claims were worthless. His final entry, written the night before he fled redemption forever, explained everything. "I have created a lie to stay alive," he wrote, "but I have preserved the truth for one who can read it. The weight of this valley is in this box. May God grant them the strength to bear it." With a deep, shuddering breath, Winnie turned her attention to the chest. The lock was old but strong. Using the pry bar, she broke it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with leather thongs, were dozens of rolled documents. She carefully untied the first one. It was a land grant from the territorial government, signed and sealed, granting 160 acres in the North Valley to a family named Miller. She knew that land. It was the heart of Silas Croft's sprawling ranch. She unrolled another, and another. The names were a roll call of the dispossessed, families she'd heard mentioned in whispers, families long gone, their property now part of Croft's empire. She found the deed for the land where Croft's ostentatious manor now stood, legally belonging to a family named O'Connell, and at the very bottom of the box, she found the true deed to the bookshop. Legally and truly the property of Elias Thorne, and by extension, now hers. The full weight of the discovery settled upon her. This was not gold or jewels. It was something infinitely more precious. It was justice written in ink and sealed with wax. It was the soul of the town, locked away in the dark. And she, the forgotten girl nobody wanted, the literate orphan in a town of sweat and grit, was the only one who could bring it to light. The knowledge of what lay hidden behind her wall changed everything. Winnie now moved with a quiet, fierce purpose that the townspeople couldn't help but notice. They saw her patching the roof with tar she'd earned, reglazing the front windows, and painting a fresh sign. They mistook her intensity for a desperate attempt to make a living. But it was something more. She was fortifying the archives, protecting the truth. Her newfound resolve did not go unnoticed by Silas Croft. He would ride by the shop slowly, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. The girl was supposed to have starved or fled by now. Instead, she was digging in. What could she possibly have found in that wreck worth staying for? He started sending his ranch hands to loiter across the street, their presence a silent, constant threat. Winnie felt their eyes on her as she worked, a cold weight of scrutiny. She knew it was only a matter of time before Croft's suspicion turned into action. The first blizzard of the season arrived without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and snow that descended on the valley like a shroud. The world beyond her newly glazed windows dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the frame of the old building and piling snow in deep drifts against the door. The town shut down, its people hunkered down by their fires, waiting out the storm's fury. On the second night of the blizzard, as Winnie sat reading one of Thorne's salvaged books by lantern light, a frantic, desperate pounding echoed from the front door. Dust shot up from his place by the stove, his back arched. Winnie's heart leapt into her throat, her first thought of Croft and his men. But the voice that cried out was thin with panic, nearly lost in the gale. "Please, help us, my boy is sick." She unbarred the door, and a man stumbled in, half carrying a woman who clutched a small, blanket-wrapped bundle. They were strangers, their faces chapped raw by the wind, their clothes frozen stiff. Their wagon, they explained in gasping breaths, had broken an axle just outside of town. The child, a boy of about 5, was burning with fever. They had been turned away from the hotel, owned by one of Croft's cronies, told there was no room. They were on the verge of freezing. In that moment, Winnie was faced with a stark choice. To let them in was to risk everything. Her meager supplies, her safety, the secrecy of what her shop contained. But to turn them away, it was unthinkable. Looking at the desperate faces of the parents and the flushed, still face of the child, she saw not a threat, but a reflection of her own past vulnerability. Without a second's hesitation, she ushered them in. "Bring him to the back," she said, her voice steady. "It's warm there." She gave them her own small room, her own cot, her own blankets. She shared her small store of beans and bread, remembering the herbal remedies her mother had taught her. She brewed a tea from willow bark she'd gathered, a folk remedy for fever. For 2 days, she nursed the boy, the bookshop transforming from a repository of secrets into a sanctuary of life. She was sheltering this family in the very building that held the power to destroy the man who would have let them perish in the snow. The act solidified her purpose. She was not merely the owner of this building, she was its steward. As the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, the child's fever broke with it. The father, a man named Miller, stood before her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "We can't ever repay you," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved our son. This place." He looked around at the dusty shelves and the quiet, peaceful air. "It's more than just a shop, isn't it?" Winnie looked from the sleeping child to the wall that concealed the town's salvation, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that he was right. The story of the Miller family and their rescue spread through redemption, faster than a prairie fire. Mr. Miller, a man with a plain-spoken and earnest gratitude, made sure of it. He told anyone who would listen how the respectable hotel had turned them away to freeze, and how the girl in the bookshop, the one they had all dismissed, had taken them in and saved his son's life. The whispers that had followed Winnie through the streets began to change. The tone of pity was replaced by one of grudging respect. then outright curiosity. The women at the well no longer fell silent when she approached. They nodded, and one even offered a quiet, "Morning, Miss Carver." It was a small shift, but it felt momentous. Winnie knew, however, that the town's goodwill was not enough. The documents in the hidden room were useless unless they were recognized by the law. She needed help. Taking the original deed to the Miller family's ancestral land and Elias Thorne's damning journal, she used a few dollars she'd earned from selling more books to rent a horse from the smithy. She rode for a full day to the county seat, a larger, more established town with a proper courthouse. In the county clerk's office, she found a young man named Mr. Davies, his face serious behind a pair of spectacles. He listened to her story with polite skepticism, his expression betraying his doubt that this dusty, earnest young woman could have stumbled upon anything of consequence. But he was a man of process and duty. He took the documents she offered and spread them out on his desk. He ran his fingers over the thick, fibrous paper of the deed. He examined the territorial seal, the faded but still legible ink. Then he retrieved the official county record, the one filed by Crofts Associates 2 decades earlier. He laid them side by side. For a long time he said nothing, his eyes moving back and forth between the two documents. Finally, he looked up at Winnie, his professional composure gone, replaced by an expression of pure astonishment. This is an original territorial grant," he breathed, his voice filled with an almost reverent awe. "The paper, the seal, it's authentic. The one on file," he tapped the official record, "is a copy. A very, very clever forgery. But a forgery nonetheless." He then read through several pages of Thorne's journal, his expression growing more grim with every line. He closed the book gently. "Miss Carver," he said, his voice now firm with resolve, "I believe you have uncovered a crime of profound significance." A week later, Mr. Davies arrived in Redemption, accompanied by 2 quiet, imposing U.S. Marshals. They did not cause a stir. They went directly to Silas Croft's grand manor. The confrontation was not a dramatic shootout, but a quiet, inexorable process of law. Faced with the undeniable authenticity of the original deeds, authenticated by Davies, and the meticulous corroborating testimony of Thorne's journal, Croft's bluster evaporated. He was a man who understood power, and he recognized immediately that his had just been broken. There was no trial. In exchange for his cooperation and avoiding federal charges for mail fraud and conspiracy, he relinquished his claims on all the properties for which Winnie held the true deeds. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled in a single afternoon. The town watched in stunned silence as the truth Winnie had unearthed rewrote their reality. Families who had been dispossessed for a generation suddenly had their land back. The power structure of redemption was dismantled, not with bullets, but with paper and ink. The townsfolk now looked at Winnie with something approaching reverence. They brought her gifts, a basket of fresh eggs, a cord of firewood, tools to help her repair the shop. They no longer saw the foolish girl who bought a wreck. They saw the woman who had restored their town's integrity. They stopped calling her the Carver girl. They began to call her Miss Carver, the keeper of the truth. Spring arrived in the valley, and with it, a sense of renewal that felt deeper than just the changing of the seasons. The snow melted, revealing green shoots on the hillsides, and the air grew soft and warm. The bookshop, once a symbol of decay, was now the vibrant heart of the reborn town. Its windows were clean and sparkling, letting in floods of bright, hopeful light. The community, in an outpouring of gratitude, had helped her restore it. The roof was sound, the floorboards level, and the shelves were repaired and organized, holding the books that had survived, now treated with the respect they deserved. Winnie had painted a new sign, her own hand carefully forming the letters. It read, "Thorne and Carver, booksellers and notary." The shop was more than a place to buy books. It had become the town's de facto records office, a place of memory and truth. The Miller family, having reclaimed their ancestral land, were regular visitors. Other families, returning to the valley, came to her to see the original deeds, to touch the paper that proved their belonging. And the children came. In a town that had valued sweat over sentences, Winnie had started holding lessons on her front porch, teaching the children their letters. She was giving them the lantern her father had given her. One warm afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the street, an old freight wagon pulled to a stop. It was Abel, the driver who had brought her to redemption what felt like a lifetime ago. He climbed down, his weathered face breaking into a wide, astonished grin as he took in the sight of the transformed building and Winnie, sitting on the steps, patiently guiding a young boy's finger as he sounded out a word. "I'll be," Abel said, shaking his head in wonder. "You built all this from just $1. Winnie looked up from the book. Her gaze drifted from the child's focused face to the peaceful town, bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. A gentle smile touched her lips. She thought of the cold, desperate girl who had arrived here with nothing but a single coin and a head full of her father's words. She thought of the weight of the truth in the hidden room and the new, lighter weight of community that had replaced it. "I didn't buy a building, Abel," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I bought a library, and I gave it back." Her simple statement hung in the air, carrying the entire moral of her journey. She was never an owner, but a steward, a librarian for the town's very soul. She stood up, dust winding around her ankles with a familiar rumbling purr. She watched the last rays of sunlight paint the peaks of the surrounding mountains in hues of amber and rose. For the first time since her parents' passing, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was home. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage. It's a reminder that the greatest treasures are often hidden not behind locks of gold, but behind shelves of forgotten words. If you were moved by Winnie's journey of finding truth in the dust, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more tales of history's hidden heroes. We'll see you next time for another story worth telling.